And we are back with our next video. This will be video number 4 on our American Baptist heritage. I'm here again with Abraham Klein. We just got out of a great service here at the family camp again in Pennsylvania. And so we're going to kind of move on here and try to continue to teach some Baptist history. And the last thing we talked about was John Clark, the first Baptist pastor in America, and the famous Rhode Island Charter. And we talked about the ramifications of that and just how that influenced our founding documents. And Rhode Island became the model for a free United States of America, and the best model, by the way. And I want to kind of move on from there. And I want to kind of fast forward, if we could, to the 1730s. Now, in the 1730s, it was kind of a tumultuous time here in the American colonies. We had, a lot of persecution had transpired from the very beginning of the colonial era, and it continued right up through the 1730s. But what began to happen was a mighty move of God in the 1730s that became known as the Great Awakening. Many of you probably that are watching this video have at least heard of the Great Awakening. Well, sometimes there's misconceptions about the Great Awakening. People just maybe assume that it started as Whitefield preached in the open air, and Jonathan Edwards just maybe went out and knocked on doors or preached in the streets, whatever the case is. But that's in fact not how it happened. The Great Awakening began as a stir in the state churches. Okay, so you have this marriage of state and church together, and in these churches, these state church congregational churches, Puritan churches, there was no gospel being preached. In fact, the halfway covenant had been installed, and the halfway covenant was a damnable heresy. What it basically allowed for was for unsaved, unregenerate people and their infants to come in, be baptized, and become full members of the church, and never have a profession of faith in Jesus Christ. Now, that kind of baffles the mind as we think about it today, but that's exactly what happened. So if you can imagine, these state churches are filling up with people who had never truly been converted. In addition to that, there was another problem. America's really in a spiritual decline, due in part to the halfway covenant in the state churches. Then also the Baptists were experiencing an inbred hyper-Calvinism that had just really grown and been entrenched in their churches. And so, on both sides you had this problem in the state churches and the scriptural Baptist churches. But in 1735, God began to light a fire under a state church preacher. His name was Jonathan Edwards. And he began to preach in a fiery way. He began to deviate from the prayer book, from what was expected of him. He began to preach a pure gospel message. Now I want you to imagine this. You're in a state church and you have all these people that have come in now for many years through this halfway covenant. Most of them are unregenerate. A lot of them are unsaved. They had never come to Christ for true salvation. And now you have this captive audience of people who are lost. And Jonathan Edwards is going to begin to preach mighty messages like sinners in the hands of an angry God, which it was recorded that people literally felt like they were falling into hell and would grip the pews and cry out. He preached that as a visiting pastor at the parish church in Enfield, Connecticut there in 1735. And as he preached that message, God really began to stir and move among those state churches. You say, well, that's not Baptist history. Well, in order for us to understand the greatest revival in American history, which is a Baptist revival, we have to understand the Great Awakening, which was truly began and really was mostly a Protestant revival. Well, what's interesting about the Great Awakening is not only were things stirring here in America with Edwards and others, but at the same exact time, God began to deal with a man's heart in England. If someone was to ask me, how do you know the Great Awakening was of God? One historian put it this way: it was as though the God of heaven reached down out of heaven, grabbed a hold of two separate continents at the same time, and began to shake them down to their heart of hearts. And so at this same time, a young man by the name of George Whitefield was at college in Oxford there, and there he had met the Wesley brothers. They were all members of a club, and that club was trying to seek God, and it was called the Holy Club. These were people who were not saved, some of them. Some were converted, but they were seeking God and a greater relationship with God. Well, it was through those transactions that this young man named George Whitefield would receive a book as a gift from Charles Wesley. And Charles would give him a book, and it was called The Life of God in the Soul of Man. And upon reading that, Whitefield realized he had never truly been converted. And after a period of time, Whitefield became heartily converted by the grace of God. And as he got saved by the grace of God, it was apparent there was a great anointing of God upon this young man. He just simply went forth to preach the gospel in its purity, In fact, his theme became, "You must be born again." And as Whitefield preached, he was mocked about that theme. In fact, somebody had stated one time, and I know this was probably asked more than once, but at least on one occasion that we have recorded, he was asked, "Why is it that all you ever preach is you must be born again?" To which he responded, "It's simple, because you must be born again." Well, as a young minister, he was mocked. They called him the child parson, the kid preacher. But the mocking stopped pretty quick, because it was evident that the power of God was on this young man, Whitefield. So you have God stirring now in two continents. Well, believe it or not, this man is ordained as an Anglican priest, Whitefield. But in August of 1739, the Bishop of London denounced him. He was no longer allowed, because he had moved so far from Anglican doctrine. Okay, that's basically Catholic doctrine, the daughter of Catholicism, no doubt. He had moved so far from Anglican doctrine in his preaching, he was no longer allowed to preach in those Anglican church buildings there in London and England. In general there. And so, but it really didn't matter at this point, because the crowds were so large that were coming to hear Whitefield at this point in time, and his fame was spreading abroad so much, in the fame of Jesus Christ under his preaching, that these buildings could no longer hold his massive crowds. And so it was kind of a win-win situation for Whitefield. Well, to make a long story short, John Wesley, then being here in America, solicited Whitefield to come and to preach in America. And he preached all over. He preached in Bermuda, he preached in Portugal, he preached in Scotland, and there was great revival all over the place. He preached in several different countries, but he began to make trips to America. When he came to America, something about those old-time Christians, they were not afraid of revival. In fact, they would fan the flames of revival, and so it was wise on the part of Wesley to try to bring Whitefield to America. When Whitefield came to America, he began to preach, and as he began to preach, great revival began to break out under his preaching. It was said that Philadelphia, when he preached there, the whole city was on an uproar. When he went to New York, the crowds were so massive, and the Anglican State Church was so against him that they ran these people out into the open fields, and the throngs followed Whitefield, and he preached them, and multitudes were saved. William Lumpkin recorded this. He said that as Whitefield preached 175 times in 75 consecutive days, that's just the summary of his Connecticut ministry. He said as Whitefield preached throughout the Northeast, he said that the religious climate of New England was changed in just 6 weeks' time. Now, that's pretty amazing. And so this is the Great Awakening. Multitudes are being saved. God is doing a great work. And at the same time, in the Baptist congregations, they're seeing revival. Well, it was interesting, because many people that got saved under Whitefield, who really was a kind of a denomination unto himself, they called themselves the New Lights, became known as the New Lights. You understand that Catholicism birthed Anglicanism. King Henry VIII rejected the authority of the Pope. And so he basically captured those Catholic churches under his realm, made them the Anglican Church. And then you have the daughters of Anglicanism, which would be Puritanism. These are those who wanted to purify the Church of England. Sadly, they still have the same Catholic dominion theology, Augustinian theological framework for their theology. And then one step away from that, of course, would be not the Puritans, but or rather the Congregationalists. And the Congregationalists basically would be yet another move away from Anglicanism and that Catholic doctrine. But the truth was, at this time, that many people that got saved under Whitefield, instead of being sucked into this new denomination, which really had, these churches had no authority to exist, no one had ever ordained anyone, no one had ever scripturally baptized anyone, they began to read their Bible, and they said, okay, Whitefield is right on the gospel, but guess what? The Bible teaches a scriptural deep water baptism and a membership in a scriptural church. And so many of them began to become Baptists and join the Baptist churches that, in frustration, Whitefield once stated, "All my chickens have turned to ducks." Now think about that statement for a moment. Why would Whitefield use those two creatures? He was very specific. By the way, he wasn't very happy about people going and becoming Baptists, okay? But he said they're chickens right now. See, now understand this. Chickens like a little bit of water. A chicken will track through a little puddle or drink a little bit of water out of a pond, but ducks now, they fully immerse and go all the way under. And that's exactly what Whitefield was saying. For at this time, the Baptist ministers were telling these masses, whether they got saved under the preaching of a Whitefield or whether they got saved under the preaching of one of the Baptist ministers, you need scriptural deep water baptism. You need to become a member of a scriptural established Baptist church. Whitefield was not very happy about that, but that's exactly what began to happen. Well, Whitefield seemingly had success just about everywhere, but sadly when he went to North Carolina, it was a dry place for him. He saw very few converts. The crowds were not near what they were in other places. And in frustration, when Whitefield went to leave North Carolina, he recorded this prayer in his journal. He stated, "O God, that thou would send forth a John the Baptist to preach and baptize in this wilderness." And you know, it's interesting because you have to be careful what you pray about. I look back sometimes and I wonder if Whitefield could have prayed that again. Would he have prayed, "God, send a Presbyterian or send a New Light or send a Congregational preacher"? But that's not what he prayed. He prayed for a Baptist, and that's exactly what God was about to do. God was about to raise up the John the Baptist who would go to the South, and there would begin the greatest revival in American history. And so if you'll stay with us on this story, I don't want to make these videos too long. Well, we're going to show you who this man was, and we're going to talk about the Great Awakening and compare it to the greatest revival in America's history, a local church-based church planting revival that would produce the Bible Belt itself and literally change the world. And so if you'll come back, we'll pick this up. I know that you know, we're cutting you off here, but you'll have to come back for the next video, and we'll tell you the rest of the story.